I think it's safe to assume that all of us have had plenty of conflict with our parents, especially as teenagers. And there are those of us now as parents who've had conflict with our own teenage children. This might be an oversimplification, but the way in which I've come to view this conflict is, on the one hand, teens feel quite powerless and view their parents as those who stand in the way of their access to power. And on the other hand, parents are afraid. They're afraid of losing their kids. And to really think about it, parents, you kind of are losing your kids. See, there was a time when they viewed you as a god or a goddess, when they really listened to you, when they found you interesting. And now, after rolling their eyes, they may wonder aloud, how am I even related to you? And parents don't feel bad about this. In fact, when it comes to the animal kingdom, humans are not the only species where we witness this. When it comes to rats, particularly adolescent rats, they seek out other adolescent rats. And scientists have been able to identify that while adolescent rats are in the presence of other adolescent rats, their dopamine levels increase. They feel good. It's exciting for them. Those same adolescent rats, when they are around adults, their dopamine levels decrease. So parents, you are not cool. I want you to take your two hands, give yourselves a hug, and repeat after me. I am not cool. You're not cool. You don't listen to the same music. You don't wear the same clothes. You don't use the same slang language that they do. In fact, if your kids tell you that they're tight, you may wonder if they need to loosen a notch on their belt. So this is why I oftentimes say, teens, when you get them, you've got them. To a large degree, parents really don't understand what it is that their teens are going through, and teens oftentimes feel like their parents just don't get them. And they will say that to me. I'm in a unique position. For over the last 20 years, I've been an educator and counselor, and I'd like to explore this conflict and ways to resolve it a bit more with you. So let's look at why this happens. First and foremost, let's take a look at the differences in brain development. What we do know is that the one part of the brain that seems to develop last is the prefrontal cortex. So in this prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that's responsible for executive functioning, organization, time management, tasks, etc., seems to be developing at the point at which kids enter adolescence. For adults, it's pretty much fully formed. So if you will, just imagine the landmass of the United States. And now with the interstate system, we can get from point A to point B relatively quickly. But prior to the interstate system, when Dwight Eisenhower was a young lieutenant colonel in the Army, it took him 56 days to get from the East Coast to the West Coast, traveling with a convoy. There were no interstates. The only main route was the Lincoln Highway, which wasn't even paved in parts of the West. So they had to take a lot of side roads to get around. And that's kind of the teen brain. The interstate isn't really there yet. It's being laid, so to speak, and there are a lot of side roads. And I'm sure that parents, you've had the experience of calling up to your son or daughter multiple times for them to take out the garbage. You've got to remember that they are getting there. They're just on that side road. We have to help them to sort of lay the asphalt to become better taskmasters. And another piece when it comes to brain development is when we look at risk. Abigail Baird of Vassar College did some fascinating research. And what she found that when presented with risky behavior, scenarios like swimming with sharks, biting a light bulb, lighting your hair on fire, presented to both teenagers and adults, teens and adults said the same exact thing. They said no to these dangerous scenarios. That's good information. But Baird found two distinct things. On the one hand, what she found was teens took significantly longer to arrive at an answer. And the other thing that happened was that teens were actually using their prefrontal cortex to arrive at this decision. In other words, Baird found that teens were thinking about these things, whereas adults were using their limbic systems, a bit more primitive emotional part of the brain, to make these split-second decisions. So when it comes to impulsive behavior, and Baird says this herself, it's kind of scary to realize that when we think that teens really aren't thinking about things, they actually, in some cases, might be thinking too much. They just don't have the experience yet. And especially when it comes to risk, teens view risk in terms of its potential social and emotional reward, whereas adults view risk in terms of physical consequences. So please remember this as well when talking about that risk, that during the period of adolescence, there is an explosion of over 2 million neurons in the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system. This is the emotional center of the brain. So what we know is that teenagers actually experience emotions 2 to 3 times greater than adults do. If our anger, fear, or excitement is here for our teens, it oftentimes is there. So parents, be curious about your kids. When they're ready to talk, they will. And just because we've all been teenagers too doesn't necessarily mean that we know what it's like to be a teenager today. There are a couple of differences. I'm part of Generation X, and I grew up being afraid of killer bees, Soviet communists, and I even drilled in school for nuclear attacks. None of those 3 things ever happened. It's a different story for kids today. Between the last decade and the 1970s, the number of mass shootings have tripled. Teens today grew up with 2 wars related to the attacks on 9/11. The Higher Education Research Institute surveys college freshmen every single year, and they ask them this simple question: do you feel overwhelmed by all that it is that you have to do? In 1985, only 18% of college freshmen answered yes to that question. In the year of 2000, that number increased to 28%. And in 2016, that number went to 41%. It's safe to assume that this is a fairly anxious group of adolescents. So when it comes to listening to our adolescents, especially when they're feeling anxious, what does that look like? Well, most communication experts and psychologists will say that listening really involves taking yourself out of the equation and being present for the other person. This is particularly challenging for parents, and I've been through this myself. And one of the reasons why could be related to a phenomenon that we call the reminiscence bump. Lawrence Steinberg of Temple University spends a lot of time exploring this reminiscence bump. It's pretty interesting. And what it basically entails is that during adulthood, the period of time which stands out for us most when it comes to our memories is our teenage years. I can remember quotes from The Karate Kid, scenes down to the T from Risky Business, moments in Silence of the Lambs. If you're part of my generation, you'll definitely know what 1.21 gigawatts means. That's that reminiscence bump. But I couldn't even tell you what I had for dinner last night. So I've seen this happen multiple times, is that when parents are in a conflict with their teenagers, they automatically go back to when they were teens and they begin to think of themselves in terms of, well, if I did this to my parent when I was younger, I would have been grounded, I would have been punished, I would have been hit. This is all done on a very subconscious level, and it's so easy for us to react. We are not teenagers today. This is a different time. This is not the 1970s, this is not the 1980s. We can parent differently. So while you're listening to your child, it's important to also be mindful of your facial expressions. A fascinating experiment, which was performed by Deborah Yergel and Todd a number of years ago at McLean Hospital while she was at Harvard, involved teenagers and adults looking at facial expressions. And what she found, similar to Abigail Baird's experiment, was that teens and adults use different parts of their brain when it comes to interpreting facial expressions. Adults use the more advanced prefrontal cortex, whereas teens relied on the primitive emotional limbic system. And in fact, Deborah Yergel and Todd found that half of the teenagers, when looking at a facial expression of fear, misinterpreted it as anger. This is oftentimes why kids will enter my office convinced that their math teacher hates them. And I will ask them, how do you know that? And they will say, because of the way that they look at me. So be mindful of when you're trying to listen to them. And teenagers, most especially, know that your parents love you and that sometimes the thing that gets in the way of their love might be their fear. Some of you might be really anxious to get into adulthood, but know that there are some people in your life who are anxious about that process because they're afraid of letting go of that child that you once were. They're slowly letting that go and allowing you to become the man, the woman that you were destined to be. So they need to be patient, and you need to be patient with them. You know, your parents may not be cool, but how much they love you is pretty cool. Thank you.